With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
What is going on, gunfighters? Saddle up for Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, ballistics, ammunition, tactics, the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Today we're going to talk about basic ballistics for common defensive handgun cartridges. I consider myself kind of a ballistics nerd, and I can often get into the weeds throwing out mass and velocity and force equals mass times velocity squared and throwing out foot-pound numbers and ballistics coefficients. And there's a certain subset, I think, of the audience who really likes that, and there's a certain subset where their eyes kind of glaze over and they have no idea what I'm talking about. If I say 400 foot-pounds of energy, that doesn't mean anything to them. So today, I thought that this would be a good episode to break it down. Kind of some pros and cons of common defensive handgun calibers. Especially since the concealed carry for newbies just came out. While you're listening to the bio or scrolling down to fast forward it, don't forget to make sure you're subscribed, following, maybe leave a review of the podcast. I'll roll into a quick abbreviated bio and then into the main topic. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I don't apologize for that. God is number one in my life. I grew up hunting and fishing in the backwoods of the southeastern United States at a very early age. Some of my earliest memories are with firearms. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. By God's grace, He got me through that safely. After that, I served as a instructor, an urban warfare instructor and a desert warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps. I also served with the L.A.P.D. both full-time as a sworn police officer and in some more specialized assignments, as well as serving in the U.S. Army, full-time and part-time National Guard. I've been a F.B.I. firearms instructor, still am an F.B.I. firearms instructor, have been for a lot of years, also N.R.A. certified and some other three-letter government agency certified. I've been a private contractor for a three-letter government agency I won't specify. I've been the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. By God's grace, He got me through all that in one piece, not because I'm better, but because He chose to have grace and mercy on me. I've been a professional hunter and guide. Professionally hunted things like buffalo and elk. Not many people today can say they've done that, but I'm blessed to be able to say that I have. I've hunted everything from white-tailed deer on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast to gray squirrel on the East Coast to prairie dog on the West Coast and elk and bear and wolf and slain all manner of beast. A state rifle and pistol champion a few times over in a few different disciplines. Enough about me, guys. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and fingers for battle. Let's get into today's topic. Okay, man. Let's talk about the .22 long rifle. It's a very common round. I don't know how common it is for defense, but I'm going to include it in here. This one's kind of unique in that it has some very big pros and some very big cons. Big pro, it is affordable, so you can train with it. Volume of practice, repetitions. That's a big, big pro. Another big pro, minimum recoil. So if you have a new shooter or somebody that's not very tolerant of recoil in a handgun, that's a big, big advantage. Those are two really big advantages. To be able to train a lot, to be able to go get a brick of 550 rounds. I don't like to talk about numbers with inflation, but to not have it cost more than a tank of gas. That's a big deal. The minimum recoil for somebody that's recoil shy, also for the ability to get fast follow-up shots. Big disadvantage. It is the weakest round that we're going to talk about today. Now, it is absolutely deadly. It is a deadly round, and many people, whether rightfully or wrongfully, have been put in the dirt with the .22 long rifle. It is a deadly round. However, there's really no argument that it's weaker than many other common defensive handgun rounds. Another big disadvantage, unlike all the others we're going to talk about today, it's rim fire. Rim fire just simply means the priming compound is around the rim. Just inherently with that, generally, .22 long rifle is going to be less reliable. That's a big disadvantage. If you're talking about a defensive handgun where your life depends on you running that gun well and that gun running, the unreliability of .22 long rifle ammo is a big disadvantage. Now, some .22 long rifle ammunition is far, far better than others. Now, I get no sponsors, no kickbacks on this show. That's why I appreciate your support. But I would never recommend somebody carry Remington Golden Bullet for defense. It's, in my experience, one of the least dependable, even of the less dependable .22. It's not meant for that, to be fair. It's meant for a high volume of practice at an affordable price. But even what I would consider a very good dependable .22 long rifle round, the CCI Mini Mag, I would say is far less reliable than a good defensive centerfire round like a Speer Gold Dot. So where does my advice stand on a .22 long rifle right now? And this may change. But I absolutely think you should have a .22 handgun. And if this is geared more towards new shooters, .22 long rifle is just the name of the cartridge. It can be chambered in handguns. That might be somewhat confusing. It's just the name of the round. It's by far the most popular of the .22 rimfires. But .22 long rifle, I would say absolutely have a handgun chambered in it for training, for that high volume of practice, to get the reps in, to master the fundamentals. Even if you have a good centerfire defensive gun, it'll likely pay for itself in ammunition alone if you're serious about training. Also, I would encourage you to have one anyway for training new shooters. Hopefully you're not just doing this for yourself. Once you become comfortable, hopefully you're introducing new shooters as well. Those .22s are great for that. So, if you had to arm somebody else or somebody that was fairly new, for all those reasons, I think you should have a .22 handgun. Maybe not your primary defensive gun. Also, where it might be good for a primary defensive option is if you're in just a very non-permissive environment where you can't carry a bigger gun, where a very, very small gun is better than no gun, right? And I say this very humbly that God has blessed me to be, a state pistol champion many times over. I can shoot a handgun well and I can run it fast. One of my favorite competitions is Steel Challenge, which is like drag racing with a handgun. So I can shoot fast. But you get to a point of diminishing returns where you get to a super small handgun, like micro compact would be generous. And if you do that in a bigger caliber like .380, which we'll talk about next, those little guns, even in the pretty mild .380, can be quite snappy. Whereas I might shoot that once, and even if I have a good grip on the gun with those small guns with a two-finger grip, that gun may move in my hand, which means I have to adjust it every single time I pull the trigger. I would rather have a .22 where I can go round after round after round, going back to that low recoil, so you're going to have less recoil, even a very small gun, where I can deliver fast, accurate, repetitive hits on target. So for a very, very small carry gun, I would go that way. Now, let's talk about the .380. Despite the name .380, it is not .380 inches. It is the same diameter bullet as a 9mm, which is .355. In fact, I think a good name for it, designated by our European shooting brethren, is the 9 Kurtz, 9mm short. It is shorter than the standard 9mm that we refer to. So it's a 9mm bullet, but it's a little bit shorter than the 9mm. It's loaded to lower pressure, and it uses a lighter bullet. For this, we're talking in general, and I want to keep this basic. This is a basic ballistics chat, right? You're talking in the 90-ish grains. You might get into the 100 grain, but common loadings, I'm going to say, are in the 90 grain-ish range. I want to stay away from numbers a lot today, but it's anywhere from, let's say, 20 to 50% lighter than a standard 9mm. And it's generally chugging around at lower velocities. What are the pros of this? Well, we talked about that 22 and the rimfire. Well, this is the first common, there are smaller ones, but the first common defensive centerfire handgun caliber we're going to talk about. That centerfire denotes reliability. If you get a good defensive round in 380, there's no reason it won't be every bit as reliable as far as detonation and performing than any other centerfire round. The same technology goes into it. If you're comparing apples to apples, like a Spear Gold Dot to a Spear Gold Dot in 9mm or 45, there's no reason it can't be round per round just as sure to go off. That's a big deal. For the pros, another pro, in addition to reliability, this cartridge has come a long way in the past, let's say, decade and a half, 2 decades. Now, this round has been around a long time. We're talking early. This was a popular, I think, carry gun caliber the turn of the last century, like early 1900s. But for a while, you were talking, basic ball full metal jacket rounds. Lately, there's been a large advance in handgun defensive bullet technology, and that has trickled down into the 380. So although it's the same round, if you found a box that had been stored properly, you might be able to get, a box of ammo from 1903 and put it in your new Glock 42 and shoot it. But the new modern rounds, I'd say, are far more effective. It takes it to the next level. I'd say far more effective than the round was 10 or 20 years ago. And this is a common round. So there are a lot of decent options in it for defensive use. Also, going back to that discussion on a super small subcompact. I wouldn't go as small as I would go with the 22, but you can get a pretty slim, compact 380 that you either are willing to carry when you couldn't carry another gun, or just a non-permissive environment, you're not going to be able to carry a bigger gun. And you've decided this is the threshold, this is the size of gun that I'm going to carry, and it's best in 380. For subcompact guns, it's a good choice. Now let's talk about some cons for the 380. It's common. It's nowhere near as common as the 9mm. So economy of scale, if you're talking apples to apples, like training FMJ versus training FMJ, or good defensive rounds versus good defensive rounds, you're not saving any money. So you're spending the same amount of money or more to shoot a less powerful round. So just because of economy of scale, even though it's a smaller, less powerful round, it's likely going to cost you more to shoot and train with than 9mm. Another issue is, since this is a fairly less powerful center fire round, and a lot of these are in really short barrels, I think you really have to do your due diligence as to whether or not these defensive rounds are going to expand. We're talking very short barrels in some of these guns, and without getting too technical, the shorter the barrel, the less velocity for most common things, like without getting to the extreme. You're going to get less velocity. Less velocity means less expansion, because hollow points to expand are velocity based, right? If you take that hollow point and drop it on the table head first, it's not going to expand. It doesn't have enough velocity. So really do your due diligence. There are some really good options in 380, as we talked about, but not all of them. Not every 380 hollow point, especially out of these micro compact guns, would I consider dependable in expansion. Okay, so without getting into foot-pounds of stuff, a very similar cartridge, I would say, as far as effectiveness, equivalency, and power is the 38 Special. Now the 38 Special is a revolver cartridge. It's pretty much straight walled with a rim. Designed for a revolver, you can drop it in and it will stop at the end of the cylinder. That rim is pretty handy for that, aids in extraction. The pros of this: it is a good, proven round. I mean, our police officers use 38 Special for decades and decades. There were still cops carrying wheel guns when I went to L.A.P.D. And I don't consider myself an old man yet. Even though we think of some really early semi-autos that have been around for a long time. We just talked about the 380 in 1903. I think a big chunk of American law enforcement officers carried wheel guns up into the 90s. The 38 Special, I believe, is by far the most common revolver round. What are its pros? Well, again, for a revolver round, super common. Also, since it's been around so long and chambered in so many different guns, you get a wide swath of projectile weights. Also, I want to get off on a tangent on revolvers versus semi-autos, but since you generally manually move the rounds, you can get a much more broad spectrum from mild to wild in the 38, even getting up in a 357 Magnum, which we'll talk about later. You see, in a semi-auto, you need a given spectrum to reliably cycle that gun. Too little and the gun won't cycle reliably. Won't push that slide back properly. Too much and you can see why that's a problem. But the revolver doesn't really have that problem. So you can go down from a really mild, let's say 90 grain, 380, all the way up into 158 grain or even higher if you hand load. But 158 grains are not uncommon in 38 Special. You compare that to the 380, that's a whole different ballpark. Not really as far as power, but as far as philosophy. That's a pretty heavy bullet chugging along at a moderate velocity. You get a much larger spectrum. Also, you can go to plus P if your revolver is rated for it. So again, you can get a much more broad spectrum of ammo power just because of the nature of the revolver. Now, just to touch briefly on reloading, one of the advantages I would say, the 38 Special is perhaps the easiest, or one of the very easiest rounds to reload for. It's pretty straightforward. Now, without getting too much into the pros and cons of semi-autos versus revolvers, just because of economy of scale, semi-autos are far more popular today, I would say, and because of that, even though 38 Special is the most common revolver round, it's not nearly as affordable as, let's say, the 9mm. It's probably on par with the 380, even though you do get a broader spectrum of projectile weights. Another disadvantage, since it's been around so long, and you can even reload it with black powder, which is pretty cool, probably not relevant to the modern defensive handgun user. At least not unless the economy collapses. But, going back to the reloading thing real quick, it's a very inefficient round. I know from reloading, I use maybe 10-20% depending on powder of that case. So a lot of that is just literally wasted airspace and extra brass. With all the new rounds coming out, I don't know why they don't come out with, let's say, a 38 Kurtz. Could literally make that round about half the size or less and still have it give pretty much the same velocities. And if you were talking about a compact carry gun and carry revolver, you could make it lighter, smaller, handier. I really don't know why nobody has done that, but they haven't. Probably because it's been around and it's proven and it's tested. If you did make that shorter round, you could chamber that in a 38 Special just by the nature of revolvers. But pretty much the frame sizes and stuff have pretty well been established. I guess it's just more hassle than it's worth. But it's an inefficient cartridge, to put that in the cons. So inefficient, it's a much bigger, bulkier round than 9mm and less powerful. I don't know if I would say less effective. If you get into the plus P and the really heavy bullets, talking like 158 grain plus P. Again, they're pretty proven rounds. Use those in law enforcement for a long time. Talking revolver, you're probably giving up capacity, but that's more of a hit on the revolver than the cartridge itself. I will circle back around and talk about the 357 later. Now let's move on to the elephant in the defensive handgun caliber arena. The 9mm. It's commonly just referred to as the 9mm. You may also, because it's been around so long and been used by so many countries, you may hear it referred to as the 9mm Luger, the 9mm Parabellum or 9 Para, or the 9x19. They are all the same cartridge. There are a lot of other 9mm cartridges that are not that cartridge. Most commonly, you'll just hear it referred to as 9mm or 9x19. Those are probably the two most common. But it is, again, the elephant in the room. And just by economy of scale, it is by far the most affordable of centerfire defensive handgun rounds. It's widely used by military, law enforcement, and civilians. I don't know the numbers of how many 9mm are made versus 380 versus 38 special, but if I was making an educated guess, I would assume it's many, many times more. Because of that, again, economy of scale, it's very affordable. That's a big pro. Another big pro is that since a lot of military, law enforcement, civilians use it, it probably gets the most R&D. We talked about technology coming a long way. I think a lot of that defensive handgun bullet technology and propellant technology came to the 9mm and then trickled down to the 380. The 9mm really has come a long way. It was a decent warfighting defensive caliber 20 years ago, but it's much better now with the advancements in modern bullet and propellant technology. That's why you see this large swing back with the jettison from agencies going away from the 40 Smith & Wesson, maybe even 45 ACP, to 9mm. It's bullet technology and everything. It's come so far that it pretty much rivals the others in performance. Also, it's fairly mild recoiling. Caveat: if we're talking about a full-size fighting handgun or even a mid-size fighting handgun, I'm talking Glock 19. I know they call it a compact. I would probably call it a mid-size, but anything Glock 19 size and up. It's a pretty mild recoiling round. Now, if you go to the very, very small subcompact, that changes. I would not call it a mild recoiling round in something like, let's say, a Beretta Nano or a Glock 43. I bought a Glock 43 when they came out, really, really early on when they came out. I took it out to the range, I shot it, and I quickly sold it. I decided for me it's just better to carry a little bit bigger gun. I like 9mm. I switched to it long before it was the large swing back to it. When the consensus was 40 or greater. I think it's a great, great balance. I think it's the best balance, which is why we've seen a large swing back to it. It's a great balance of effectiveness and shootability. Round per round, there are other rounds, I will concede, that are better terminally as far as ballistics effectiveness on target. There are better rounds round per round. You generally give up shot recovery time. I don't care how big a round it is if we're talking about common defensive handgun rounds. I don't think you're going to make up enough in the ballistics to make up for getting good, quick follow-up shots on target. The majority of handgun rounds, I believe, are not fatal, which tells you that you may need to take more than one shot. If you have like a determined attacker that needs to be physically stopped, not like a mental, psychological stop. So the ability to deliver repeated, well-aimed shots on target is a big deal, and I think the 9mm strikes a good balance on that. I think it rightfully deserves its place as the de facto defensive handgun caliber of our time. That said, it's not without its disadvantages. And perhaps this is more of a hit on the gun industry and manufacturers, but in my opinion, the 9mm, also known as the 9mm Luger, is best in its original design in firearms. A full-size combat handgun. It's what I generally carry day to day as a concealed carry gun, a defensive gun. I think that's where it's best. Like the 9mm Luger, it's a full-size gun. The Beretta 92, it's a full-size gun. The Glock 17, it's a full-size gun. Glock 19, okay. Smith & Wesson compact, M&P compact that is, okay. But when you start getting into these micro compact little teeny 9mm, I think you've tipped the scales and you've gotten away from that good balance of shot recovery time. You might be better served going to a smaller caliber. It's not the fault of the cartridge, but when you start shoving it into these very, very tiny guns, I'd say you give up more than you gain. Also, a lot of the loadings, I would say the most popular here on the civilian market is 115 grain. I would say that's not the best ballistically. Some people may argue they might think it's the best, but I would like, or I do prefer, 9mm and a little bit heavier bullet weight. We're talking, I prefer 124 and up. I prefer 147s. Also, not the fault of the cartridge, but a lot of that R&D and stuff that I talked about that goes into the round for law enforcement and such agencies, most of those are carrying what? Mid to full-size fighting handguns, not a super micro subcompact. So just because it's a good load that's preferred by the F.B.I, by your local department, I think that's some of the worst advice I hear, is carry what your local PD carries. Not if you don't carry the same gun, because if they carry a Glock 17, that round may expand very well out of a Glock 17, but it may not expand at all out of your Glock 43. So again, a lot of that R&D went into full-size guns with longer barrels, which gives you more velocity, which again, hollow points have an expansion velocity threshold. If you start shedding off all that velocity because you chop the barrel in half, all that R&D kind of goes out the window because it wasn't designed for those parameters. Not a fault of that cartridge, not a fault of that loading. It may be a very good loading, again, out of a Glock 17 or a Beretta 92, but maybe not so much out of your 365. So I think not the fault of the cartridge, but there's a lot of false security like, oh, this is a good proven round. It might be out of a full-size fighting handgun, and hopefully that's what you carry. But if not, don't get that false sense of security from that round. Do I carry a 9mm in such and such a good street proven round? Yeah, but not proven out of your platform. It's a much different animal when you put it into that smaller handgun. Now let's talk about the 40 Smith & Wesson. I want to keep this basic. I don't want to get too much into the history. 40 Smith & Wesson. It's a little bit bigger of a bullet. I am going to tell you straight up, I am not a fan of the 40 Smith & Wesson. It is a pretty high pressure cartridge. It is a pretty snappy cartridge. And again, perhaps like the 9mm, one of the big disadvantages is not a disadvantage of the cartridge itself, but of the guns it is chambered in. Before I start hating on the 40, and it's hard not to for me, let me be fair and give it some advantages. Right now, there are quite a few really good surplus handguns in 40. I said there was a big kind of jettison of the 40 cal by a lot of agencies and departments. Well, that means you can usually find some pretty good deals, right now at least, on surplus 40 cal handguns. I saw some really good deals not that long ago on like good SIG 226s and such, which is a fantastic fighting handgun. And ammo. Back at my last job before I was doing the podcasting full time, we had literal just 1,000-round boxes of 40 that we just had stacked on stacked, and the prices on those were really good. And we're talking good quality ammo. So that's a plus right now. The surplus market is probably the best on 40 cal versus anything else. Another big plus, since it was kind of designed to be the same overall length, give or take, as the 9mm to fit in similar size handguns, that means they had to make that bullet short and fat, which means the most of the bullet profiles are a truncated cone or a flat pointed bullet. I think that's superior design for terminal performance, even if we're talking non-expanding ammo, than a round nose bullet. Now you can get that bullet profile in a 9mm, and I do prefer it. But almost, I'm sure there's probably an exception, but almost in all the rounds that I know of, N.40 are that flat truncated cone or flat point design, which I think as a bullet profile design is better. So that's an advantage of the 40. Now let's talk about disadvantages. Going back to the guns it's chambered in. If you take a large handgun that was designed for a large cartridge, like a 1911 pattern, it's not a bad round to shoot. It's pretty good and mild recoiling as far as shot recovery times and stuff go. If we're talking like a staccato STI, back in the day, STIs were real common in 40 caliber because it was, without getting too much in the weeds, it was kind of the best bang for your buck for USPSA limited division, which was a very popular division. If you're shooting it in a 1911 size and weight of gun, it's not bad. The problem is that the majority, I think, of guns chambered in it, they took guns that were originally designed in 9mm and tried to shove a 40 in there. And there were several problems, at least early on with this, as far as guns not being able to handle the pressure, not being able to handle up to the abuse of the 40. But aside from that, because a lot of that was worked out a long time ago, as far as me, the end user, if I take a gun that was designed to shoot well and have good shot recovery time and handle well in 9mm, and I put a 40 in it, which is a higher pressure round, heavier grain weight of bullet, common for that is a 180. It's a real snappy gun in most common platforms, like a Glock 22 I think is a horrible choice. It was my first issued duty gun after the Marine Corps, after my Beretta 92. The Glock 22, the Glock 22 was my original issue for L.A.P.D. I think that's a horrible handgun, because you're basically taking a Glock 17, which is a good shooting handgun. As much as I don't prefer Glocks, if I'm being fair, it's a really shootable handgun. You shove a 40 in it, that gun was designed for 9mm. It does not drive as nicely with 40. I give up a lot in shot recovery time. And I don't think that the juice is worth the squeeze. I don't think it's a good trade-off. Similar like a SIG 229, I carried one of those M40 for a while. Again, in a 9mm, the SIG 226 or similar is a fine shooting handgun. M40, not so much. So even in common full-size guns, like standard 9mm frame guns that we just talked about, I think it's a bad pairing. Another one is cost. Unless you're getting crates of surplus ammo, it's going to cost you more. It's going to cost you more than 9mm. Now, let's talk about the big boy, the 45 ACP. Nobody is going to argue that the 45, I don't think, is a ballistically good round. It is. And we talked about the 9mm coming a long way in ballistics performance. From good to really good. Just because it has grown a lot doesn't mean the 45 has not grown at all. I'd say it has grown in ballistic performance, just not to the same rate of the 9mm. The 9mm has come forward a lot. It's gotten the most R&D. But some of that has also bled out into the 45. There are a lot of really good loads, I think, that borrow some of that R&D that was initially done for the 9mm into the 45. There are some really good 45 defensive loads. Just because the 9mm has gotten a lot better doesn't mean the 45 hasn't gotten better, and it was good to start with. Ballistically, it's a good round. You're talking a much heavier bullet. You're talking, without getting too nerdy into the numbers, I said the most common probably for 9 is 115 grain. The most common, kind of the standard for 45, is 230 grain. Literally double. You can go lighter on the 45 and heavier on the 9, but just for rough numbers, right? Double. A moderate velocity, you're talking almost exclusively, unless you get into the weeds on light bullets and plus P, subsonic round. Meaning less than the speed of sound, chugging along, but respectable and potent. So big advantage, ballistic performance. Bullets can do weird things, and even the best designed bullet could fail to expand. The 45 starts out at 45 caliber. It's big to start with. I still want a expanding round, But if you're talking non-expanding rounds, I'd say the 45 is still kind of king of the hill as far as performance goes. Said I could not use. For whatever reason, I couldn't use it. I think 45 is still the best common defensive handgun in non-expanding ammo. Again, I want expanding ammo. Even more so than the 9mm. And in my opinion, for whatever reason, I think in a similar handgun, I think it is more mild as far as recoil. It's probably not as far as physics go, as Newtonian physics, but as far as the sensation on me, the shooter, I prefer the recoil of a 45 over a 40. And if I'm choosing between those two, even though I might give up a little bit of capacity, I'd go with the 45. If you offered me a 1911 in 40 or 45, and I do make them in 40, I would almost certainly take the 45. Unless you said I was competing in USPSA limited division. But for defensive use, yeah, the 45 in like a 1911 size gun. And I even think the recoil is better in general. So if I went to a smaller than 1911 size gun, I think I would still prefer the 45 over the 40. Big disadvantage, in general, capacity. You can get big, high capacity 45s, but they're a big gun. Talking like a Mark 23 or HK 45 or a FNX 45. They're big guns, double stack. Glock 21. And I would say for most people, that's a disadvantage. A lot of people, that's going to be too big to carry. Now, I carry a full-size fighting handgun with an optic, so it's not really that for me. But if you have average size hands, which I'd say I have average size hands, they're kind of too big to shoot effectively. The 1911, no. The 1911, I think, is a superb ergonomic gun and will fit an average shooter. But if you're talking the high-capacity 45s, Glock 21, FNX 45, they're, I think, too big to be gripped well. Let me use this analogy. If you're big on fitness and pull-ups, it's harder to do pull-ups on a fat bar than a skinny bar. I prefer a 1-inch bar, 1 1/4, okay. You start getting into the bigger pull-up bars, it's hard to grab them as tight and do as many pull-ups. Same thing if you're trying to grip that handgun and shoot really fast. You get a really fat grip. In fact, that's one of the things weightlifters do. I even have a pair of, I forget what they're called, but they're basically fat grips that you put on dumbbells to make it harder to do the exercise. If my life depends on it, I don't want it harder to do the exercise of shooting quickly. But that's a big disadvantage. You either have to give up some capacity, I think, or go to a big gun. Now, I said that's a disadvantage for most, for me and for the average size hand shooter. If you have just really big hands, maybe that's an advantage for you, because maybe to you a Glock 17 is just too small. I don't know. I have average size hands. But if you have really big hands, maybe that bigger gun is an advantage. A bigger grip is an advantage. But I think for the vast majority of people with average size hands, or even slightly larger than average, you'd have to get pretty big. I'd say that's a disadvantage. Another disadvantage to the 45 ACP is cost. It's not a cheap round to shoot. It's quite a bit more expensive than 9mm. And that's a big disadvantage. When I first started competition shooting, I was in law enforcement. I decided I wanted to get better and start shooting competition. I started out with a 45. That's what I was carrying at the time. And I quickly realized I could shoot a lot more, train a lot more, practice a lot more in 9mm than I could with 45. And I think I was far more effective being able to train, let's say, twice as much, unless you just have a blue sky unlimited ammo budget, right? I would rather be able to train twice as much with a 9 than half as much with a 45. Just on cost alone. If you said my training allotment, my training budget this month is $150 for ammo. I can buy a lot more 9mm for that money than I can 45, unless there's some weird anomaly sale or something, but you spread that out throughout the year, and you're going to get quite a bit more training in with the 9mm. So that's a big disadvantage, cost. Now, I said I would circle back around to the 357. Perhaps, round per round, the most effective common handgun round. It is kind of known for that, being a very effective handgun round. The very powerful common handgun round. Much like we talked about the advantage of the .38 Special, because it's a revolver cartridge, and I'm not talking about like a Desert Eagle or a Kunin or a common carry handgun. It's going to be a revolver in .357 Magnum. Again, since you manually rotate the rounds through the chamber, through the firing position, you can have a large spectrum. Right? Unless you have some kind of squib load, the reliability of that gun is not dependent on the force of the round. And that's more of an advantage of the revolver, but I can't really separate the two completely. You can go down to 110 grain .357. You can go up to, we talked about 158 grain, which is common. I have some 180 grain .357 Magnum loads that I plan on being my backup Alaska load, at least as it stands now. I still need to do some proper T&E. But you get that broad spectrum, and because of that, you can shoot .38 Special in pretty much any revolver I'm aware of. .38 Special can be fired safely in .357 Magnum, not vice versa. But you can train and shoot, especially introduce maybe a new shooter with .38 Special in the same handgun. There are other calibers you can shoot out of there, but for common ones, you can shoot .38 Special in a .357 Magnum. You may decide for a given situation, day to day, you want to carry .38 Specials because you get that faster shot recovery time. In fact, I do the very same thing. Not my go-to carry gun, but one I will carry often is a little Smith & Wesson J-frame snub-nose, very light, 11 point something ounces, .357 Magnum. In general, if it's like an urban environment, I'll mostly carry .38 Special because I've shot them both. I think the advantage of getting quick follow-up shots on target outweighs the ballistic advantage of the .357. Sometimes, if I'm professionally big game hunting and guiding, or again, going to be in the backcountry of Alaska, yeah, I'm going to load it up with .357 Magnum. I like that flexibility. The .357 Magnum, again, ballistically, that's a bonus. It's perhaps the best ballistic round for round. It's also, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, the best crossover round. If you want a round that's good for defense and good for hunting, I think it straddles that line really well. It's a really good defensive round, and it's a really good hunting round for medium game, and even up to large game with the right bullet selection. Now, caveat, I didn't say the same load. I would not use the same load for defense as I would use for hunting. Those are different loads, but the same caliber, the same round, the same .357 Magnum. If I wanted a round that would do both, and I love to handgun hunt, so if I'm looking for a good dual purpose, like, I can think of nothing better as a dual purpose defensive handgun and hunting handgun than, let's say, a medium frame 4-inch, something like a K-frame or a Colt Python, right? That medium size revolver in .357 Magnum. So if you're into survival and preparedness and you want kind of that duality function of that. Now, let me be clear. Handgun hunting is a challenge. As somebody that's been blessed to do a lot of handgun hunting and dispatch a lot of animals with a handgun, it's challenging. It's nowhere near as good as a long gun. If I was going to put meat on the table, I would never take like a .357 Magnum revolver over a much cheaper pump shotgun or a decent deer rifle if I was going out for deer hunting. If you're talking about, though, a handgun that is equally suited for both, probably the best option would be that. So that flexibility is a big advantage of the .357, along with the ability to shoot .38 Specials round for round. Also, there's something called, since you don't have to worry about feeding from a magazine into feed ramps and things without getting too technical, bullet shape and profile really is irrelevant, should be irrelevant to the reliability of the handgun. Something like a wad cutter, semi-wad cutter, talking about non-expanding rounds, is pretty good. Not as good as I would rather have a hollow point expanding round. If for whatever reason you couldn't have one, or you wanted to make a lot of ammo cheaper, casting like hard cast semi-wad cutters are pretty ballistically effective out of the .357 Magnum. Disadvantages: recoil, right? There's no free lunch. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I think out of a mid-size, talking about like a 4-inch Colt Python or a Smith & Wesson K-frame combat Magnum, not unmanageable. I would certainly rather shoot one of those than like a Glock 22 and 40. as far as recoil goes. But just by the nature of revolvers, you're probably giving up capacity there, so that's a disadvantage. Recoil is a disadvantage. And they're spendy. They're even generally probably more expensive than .38 Special. So those are some disadvantages. And I will talk briefly about the 10mm. I think it's come back in vogue as of late, the last several years, and I like to see that. I think it's a good cartridge. I think the 357 Magnum is a better crossover hunting and defense cartridge, but the best one in the semi-auto world, because a lot of people, revolvers don't interest them at all. They came into the gun culture 2.0 with AR-15s and Glocks, and just revolvers seem very esoteric and irrelevant to them. They're just not interested in revolvers. For a semi-auto cartridge, the best crossover, I think, is 10mm as far as defense and hunting. Advantages, again, it's very good ballistically round for round. If you want a wildlife defense gun and a handgun, but you also want to have good defense against people, because people behave badly in national forests, national parks as well. There's, I believe, several occasions of like serial killers and things operating in national parks, national forests. Why? You might be there secluded, no cell service. You could see why, sadly, people would take advantage of that. So people behaving badly, I think, often is overlooked. You're in bear country and you're focused on bears, but people behaving badly is a thing there too. An adult human male can by far be more deadly than a grizzly bear, or a lion for that matter. Can be the most dangerous creature on the planet, whether for good or bad. So if you wanted a good dual-purpose cartridge for, let's say, animal defense and human-on-human crimes against people, and you wanted it in a semi-auto, and you wanted more capacity than you're probably going to get in a 357, then yeah, 10mm for sure. There's a lot of really good options. 10mm handguns. And unlike the 40, most 10mm are going to be in that full-size handgun. There are compact 10mm. I would say probably stay away from those, especially if you're talking about like wildlife defense gun, because again, you're giving up when you chop off that barrel. You're giving up quite a bit. But in a full-size fighting handgun, and a big disadvantage, recoil. Again, there's no free lunch. Even if you're talking like a 1911, you're probably going to get more recoil, more unpleasant recoil out of that than you would even a 45 ACP. So there's no free lunch there. Also cost. 10mm is not cheap. Although it's become a lot more popular lately, it's still an expensive round. It's still bordering on that boutique round kind of price. It's not cheap. Another big disadvantage is not a fault of the cartridge and the dimensions specifically, but a lot of that is really kind of downloaded, because let's face it, a lot of people that have 10mm just go to the range and shoot to 10mm, and a lot of those are loaded fairly similar to a 40 Smith & Wesson. You're paying the extra price and all that stuff. For a lot of the loadings, look at what they are putting a bullet out at versus a hot 40 Smith & Wesson. So do your due diligence. Don't just think just because the brass is stamped 10mm that it's somehow a powerhouse. You certainly can get powerhouse loads in specific brands and loadings. It certainly can be much more potent, I think, than a 40 Smith & Wesson. However, don't just assume because it's stamped 10mm it's more potent. A lot of those are kind of downloaded. Well, that's a disadvantage. And I think that's all the common handgun rounds, defensive rounds I'm going to talk about today. There are plenty of others that I'm not going to talk about because I don't think they're very common. It doesn't make them not good, right? That doesn't mean 357 SIG is not a good round. They're just not very common. Did a whole episode on that cartridge. But for common defensive rounds, for the person that likes guns, is into shooting, wants to conceal carry, just doesn't care so much about the nerdy numbers. And I'm a ballistics nerd. I'm not saying that disparagingly. I like that stuff, but I know not everybody does. So kind of a sober step back and look at common defensive calibers. There are pros and cons. I hope this was helpful. If you already knew all this stuff and much more, consider sharing this show. Right? This is a blessing. I consider it open source. When it comes to the podcast, when it asks for owner, I put God. God is the owner of this podcast. He gives me speech. He gives breath in my lungs. Share this. It's meant to be shared. Blessings are meant to be shared. They're not meant to be hoarded. You don't get your talent and bury it in the ground. You share it. You multiply it. so you can be a great help and blessing. If you think somebody would benefit from this episode or any other episode of Gunfighter Life, please feel free to share. Please. Also, if you want to support, something I don't often mention, there is a gear shop. You can get there via goodshepherdtraining.com if you want some cool gear. Maybe support that way. You don't want to just give for free on Patreon to support the podcast. You could check out the merchandise, goodshepherdtraining.com. Gunfighters, if you listened to all of that, I really am humbled that you listen to the podcast, that you come here for advice. I'm blessed to be able to serve you. If you thought you got any kind of value in this or any other episode, hopefully you'll consider supporting. This podcast is kind of paying it forward. You can listen for free. If you get something out of it, hopefully you'll consider giving back. If this is a ministry that you feel called to support, I make no apologies in saying this is primarily a ministry. Mission statement being to make godly men strong and strong men godly. It's also a small business with the fees and everything associated with that. So if you want to support an American, small, employees number 1, myself, veteran operated business, if you think that's something you want to help out with, consider becoming a patron. There should be a link in the show notes. And if not, please continue to listen for free and don't feel guilty about it. And as a thanks for staying tuned through all that, if you're still listening, the tactical tip of the day. You know I'm big on the baby bug out bag concept. One thing I don't often mention, but as I look down, it's in the very front pouch of this. You might know what that is. That's a predator call. I like to keep one of those handy if I'm going out hunting in the backcountry or scouting in the backcountry or just in the backcountry. You may have come up with 0 to punch your tag for a deer or an elk that day, but maybe you want to center punch a coyote. Usually legal in a lot of western states or in a lot of states. Now coyotes have spread a lot. Maybe you haven't seen anything and you're about to leave. You got 15 minutes of good light left. You don't think you're going to see any deer. Maybe you want to call in a coyote. Maybe, I would assume that you're armed if you listen to this. Maybe you're out in the backcountry just hiking and you're armed and you stop for a minute. Maybe you want to blow that predator call, even if you have no intention of shooting it. Now, you should be ready in case it's dangerous, but maybe you just want to see some cool wildlife, a bobcat, a coyote. There's plenty of times I see wildlife, and even if I legally can, I don't shoot it. Sometimes it's just nice to see a coyote, a bobcat, a wolf. I don't know that I would do that if I was only armed with a handgun in grizzly bear country. Maybe not, but the vast majority of other times. Maybe you want to do that, or maybe you want to switch. You've been out turkey hunting. It's spring right now. I don't know when you're going to listen, but it's spring right now. You're out turkey hunting. No turkeys anywhere nearby. Haven't heard a turkey call all day. Maybe before you go, hit the predator call, see if something runs in. You got a good turkey load in there, you can probably take care of a coyote at a reasonable distance. Also, I think it would be a remiss to not mention, I've done a whole episode on like my go-to 9mm defensive loads, but I'm going to mention just real quick. Try and keep it to 2, just so you can start out. You need to test these out of your gun. But 22 CCI Mini Mag, I'd start there. Winchester Super X. 380 Federal HST, Hornady Critical Defense. 9mm Winchester Ranger T 147s, 147 grain, Spear Gold Dot 147s in the 9mm. 40 Smith & Wesson Federal HST 180 grain, Remington Golden Sabers. 45 ACP, I like the 220 grain plus P critical duty, and the Spear Gold Dot 230s. 38 Special, if your gun can handle plus P, I like the Spear Gold Dot 135 grain plus P short barrel load. They make a load especially designed for short barrels. I like that load. If you want something super light recoiling and a very small compact 38, you might look at the Hornady 90 grain. It may not shoot point of aim, point of impact, so I'd recommend this primarily if you have adjustable sight revolver. If you want a really mild recoiling round, there you go. 357 Magnum. I'm going to recommend the Barnes Solid Copper 125 grain in 357 Magnum. Also the Spear Gold Dot 135 grain 357 Magnum load. 10 millimeter, I'm going to recommend the Spear Gold Dot 200 grain. If you're looking for that larger animal defense for the 10 millimeter, you might look at Buffalo Bore. They make a hard cast, 220 grain. And that, ladies and gunfighters, is going to bring us to the tactical verse of the day. Hopefully you've been waiting with bated breath. Now, whatever caliber you choose, whether it's a Ruger LCP in 22 or a SIG 220 in 10 millimeter, or for that matter, you're rolling around in an Abrams tank. A shout out to First Cav as I served with them. Whatever the weapon is, it's God who gives us strength for battle. Verse. It is God who arms me with strength for battle. You make my way perfect. You make my feet like the feet of a deer. You set me on high places. You teach my hands to make war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Psalm 18. Thanks, men, and have a blessed day.